Hey everyone, so we're going to kick off the third video, right? Going over laws, structures, and clinical roles for your wellness clinic. So bear with me here on this one, right? So first and foremost, every state has different laws regarding what you need to have in place in order to set up your wellness clinic. Not only that, I can't provide legal advice to you, so you're going to want to likely get with the lawyer just to make sure you run through a lot of these things with them on what the practices are in your state. One thing about laws are there are a lot of gray areas. There are a lot of different ways that they are applied. And so that's important for you to know for your state specifically and for your licensure level. So NPs, RNs, non-clinicians, everyone kind of has a different take or sense of how these laws are kind of placed on you in your state. And so that's very important for you to know. So bear with me as we go through this. I'm going to do my best to talk to this high level at the very least in the complexities of these laws. So as we get into this, we're going to talk a bit more about it. Again, this is not legal advice, but I want to give you a sense of how this stuff works. So as you're learning about it, as you're reading about it, as you're speaking with your lawyer, you can kind of have at least a sense of what they're speaking to. And so you know how to apply it for your wellness clinic. So first and foremost is the agenda. We're going to go over your overview. Then we're going to decide on the LLC or PLLC and the CPLM rules in your state. We're going to determine if an MSO is required. Then we're going to talk about a medical director versus a collaborating physician. And then the scope by service for your licensure level. And then lastly, as always, key takeaways. So first and foremost, please share the course. Let's help more NPs and RNs build freedom through ownership. As always, if you invite them using your link, they'll get a 40% commission, or you'll get a 40% commission for anything that they purchase with us as they go forward. Lastly, just a warning here, this is the most important video in the course, so please watch it all the way through. Try not to skip around. This is going to be very helpful for you when it comes to setting your clinic foundation. And then lastly, pro tip, watch this video at 1.75x speed so you can get through it a lot faster and get to making the steps you need to make to launch your clinic. So let's go over that overview. So at this stage, your goal is to determine how your clinic must be legally and clinically structured. You are not filing any paperwork at this stage, but you are identifying the correct path forward. At this point, it's like I want you to do this and then stop and think before we move to any other steps, because this ultimately is going to lead you along the path. And so this step prevents you from choosing the wrong entity or services. What I don't want you to do is speed by this, start implementing a lot of things in the way of services and your entity, all those types of things, and then come to some realization later on that you didn't do it right, and then you have to do a lot of rework. And so everything you decide here will guide you legally as you set up everything later. So deciding between your LLC, PLLC, and the CPLM rules around that. So you want to start by determining whether your state allows other outside of medical doctors to own medical practices. So I will say, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, you as a nurse practitioner, a registered nurse, or a non-clinician will need to set up an LLC. Typically, PLLCs, which stands for Professional Limited Liability Corporations, are only able to be started and owned by medical doctors in the case of a wellness clinic. Granted, PLLCs are for wellness doctors, lawyers, accountants, architects, and things like that. So I still want you to go take a look, Google, do registered nurses need an PLLC and enter the state name for a wellness clinic? What you would typically see is on Google, it'll have an AI overview that pretty much run down the laws and things in your state pretty quickly for you. But then you can also click any of those lawyer business website links that can also kind of give you a sense of it as well. So if you are a licensed provider, your state may require a PLLC instead of an LLC. So it's important for us to know that at this stage. Your goal is to identify which entity is allowed for your role and for your state. And so please do that, because that's going to ultimately help us with setting up the right entity when that time comes. Next, you want to decide if you need a medical director or a collaborating physician. So you want to review your state rules to determine if physician oversight is required for the services that you want to offer in your clinic. So identifying those will determine whether oversight applies to your provider, your services, or your prescribing authority. So what I mean here is, for instance, a nurse practitioner is going to need a collaborating physician at the provider level. A registered nurse may need a medical director at the provider level, right? Because you're a registered nurse, and to provide you protocols and standard orders for you to then do the services that you're going to be doing within your clinic. Again, now some services require different things. So for instance, in some states, although a nurse practitioner may only need a collaborating physician at a high level, because some of the services within a wellness clinic are what they are, you may also need a medical director. In different states, again, have different laws. There's some states where you do need a medical director. There's some where you don't. There's some states you do need a collaborating physician. There are some that you don't. And then for prescribing authority, so for instance, here in Texas, a nurse practitioner has to have a collaborating physician to prescribe any medication. And so you may need a collaborating physician behind you to do any type of sort of prescriptions. And so again, these are all important things to identify when it comes to oversight very early on. So to give you a sense of what a medical director does, they provide oversight for your clinic itself, right? So not over you, the provider necessarily, but over the clinic itself and the services within that clinic. So a medical director provides clinical accountability and oversight for the wellness clinic itself, typically due to the services being offered. And a collaborating physician is used when a state law mandates collaboration for nurse practitioners. In some cases, nurse practitioners may need both a collaborating physician and a medical director. In most states, one medical doctor can act as both. All right. So again, the separation there is the medical director oversees the wellness clinic and the clinical operations in the wellness clinic, while the collaborating physician oversees the license of a nurse practitioner and their roles and responsibilities as a nurse practitioner. So again, these two things are different, but again, in some states, you may need both if you're a nurse practitioner, and one person can act as both. Now, that is not the case with every state, but like I said, in a lot of states, that is the case. So if you're in a full practice authority state like Arizona, you don't have to really worry about any of this. But if not, this is something we want to make sure that you know and you have an understanding of. So once we get to the point of trying to find a medical director or collaborating physician, we know exactly what we need. So determine if an MSO structure is required. So in the case that your state only allows medical doctors to own and oversee medical services due to the corporate practice of medicine laws, a management service organization is likely required. So I'm going to go through the rest of this slide, and I'm going to show you a diagram of what an MSO is and kind of get into some more details around that. But let's finish this out first, just for the takeaways here. So an MSO structure separates the clinical control from the rest of the business. The clinical entity is responsible for the patient care, and the MSO is responsible for the non-clinical operations like marketing, supply, staffing, and accounting. And then this model will require a management service agreement between the clinical entity and the MSO. This typically is an agreement between your medical director's organization and your LLC, stating that the medical director will provide clinical oversight over the clinical services while you manage and operate the business. So let me just talk a bit more about this. So in strict states like here in Texas where we are, if you are a nurse practitioner or a registered nurse or a non-clinician, you cannot oversee or manage the medical services within your wellness clinic. That's the letter of the law, right? And so due to that, you have to do an MSO structure and make an agreement between you and the medical director who owns a PLLC to separate the responsibilities within the wellness organization. And so I'm going to show you something here. So in order to get an understanding of what these laws are in your state, you can literally go to Google and be very specific about what you Google. So in this case, can NPs operate a wellness clinic in Texas? As it says, yes, NPs can operate a wellness clinic in Texas, but due to Texas's restrictive practice model, they cannot do so independently for medical services. They must have a formal collaborative practice agreement. So that's that collaborating physician agreement we were talking about. And then if we skip down to right here, a physician must generally hold majority ownership over 50% in a medical practice, but NPs can own business entities like LLCs that support the practice under proper legal structures, often using management service organizations to separate business from clinical oversight, right? So again, if you read this sentence, it may scare you because it says, you know, a physician must generally hold majority ownership over 50% in a medical practice. So this is where I say you want to speak to a lawyer about a lot of these things because, as I know from my experience with working with others across different states as well as being here in Texas, the exact words of this law is not necessarily what's happening in practice out there, especially when you create a management service organization. The physician actually doesn't need to own any of your business, right? You own the LLC, they own the PLLC. Y'all make an agreement in the middle, and that separates the ownership in a lot of different ways. So let me show you a diagram here really quickly of what this sort of looks like. So if you come here, this is our paid course here. I'm going to go inside of that for us right now, and we're just going to scroll down to the management service organization. So this is a kind of a model that I built, or not necessarily the model that I built, but just a diagram of the model that I built that what's being used predominantly these days inside of the wellness clinic industry. So as you can see here, you have the MSO, which is owned by you, which is typically an LLC. Then you have the PLLC that's owned by the medical director. In the middle here, you have an MSO agreement. And what an MSO agreement ultimately does is it outlines the responsibilities of the MSO and the responsibilities of the PLLC in order to show that the clinical oversight and operations within the clinic are managed by the PLLC, while the MSO manages everything outside of clinical practices inside of the business itself. So what happens is patients pay for medical services, and those flow into the PLLC and the PLLC bank account. And then what typically happens and what we're seeing across the industry is that the monthly revenue minus the MD payment goes to the MSO, while what stays in the PLLC account monthly is the flat fee that you pay your medical director. So again, this is the model that we're seeing predominantly throughout the industry. And so that's why I say reading sentences like that may scare you and make you think, oh, this person has to own some of my business and all those other things. But that's not the actual practice that we're seeing across the industry. And so these are the type of things that you'd want to bring to your lawyer to get an understanding of what they're seeing. And by all means, you want to get a lawyer who is well versed in the wellness clinic industry that can help you and advise you on these types of things. But ultimately, what I want you to see that is if you do live in a strict corporate or practice of medicine state that says you must have an MSO if you are a nurse practitioner or registered nurse or a non-clinician, that you have a sense of what's happening outside, what these models look like, so you can make a well-informed decision around what compliance you need in your state. So again, I apologize here. These things can get kind of complex, but I just, again, want to give you an overall sense of what it looks like. So we're going to hop back into the slides here and keep on going through this. So next, we want to identify who can perform each service after you get a sense around whether you need to build out an MSO or not, because this kind of flows into that as well as whether you need a medical director or collaborating physician. So you want to list out all the services that you plan to offer in your clinic. And so once you have a good sense of what those services are, you want to determine which of those services involve diagnosing, prescribing, or medical decision making, right? Because this is going to determine whether or not you can do those things in your state, right? Or more so, is going to make you think about whether or not you can do those things in your state, right? If you're a registered nurse, you're not unable to diagnose in most, if not all states. You're unable to prescribe in most, if not all states. You're unable to make definitive medical decisions in most, if not all states. So that's why we want to go through this process. And some services require you to do these things, some of them don't. So you want to identify whether those services can be performed by NPs, RNs, or if they require physician involvement at all. And then the common services that we offer, like IV therapy, weight loss, hormone therapy, and aesthetics, they tend to have different scopes, considerations across all the different states. And so the next thing we want to do here is I provided a template for you underneath this video. It'll include this table that we'll talk about here later, but you can also use throughout this process to write down what services you are going to offer, and then as you take a look at your state laws, what oversight requirements are required and what kind of staff can do it. So what I do want you to take a look at is this general staffing recommendations. So again, this is not legal advice at all. I just want to again give you a high level sense of what the general laws are across most states. Your state may differ, but again, I'm just trying to get you to think about these things and what's important to take a look at and what these things mean as you're doing your research. So in the legend here, you'll see we have general supervision, which means your MD is available by phone or telehealth. So they're not actually sitting in the clinic itself. And then reviews charged periodically. So this is the most common type of supervision that you'll see across wellness services. Now, direct supervision. Now, this is when your medical director must be on site during the procedure itself. This is less common. This is typically with very high risk services or in very restrictive states. Then you have standing orders and protocols. So this is a written permission outlining specific services the RN and LVN can perform independently day to day. So again, the medical director does not have to be in the clinic. A nurse practitioner does not have to be in the clinic for them to perform the service, right? Not prescribe it, not diagnose it, but perform it. So for instance, let's look at IV therapy here. So obviously medical directors, medical doctors, DOs can prescribe and mix and administer IV therapy. Same with the nurse practitioner. They can prescribe, mix, and administer IV therapy within most states, right? Now, you might need a collaborating physician, you might need a medical director, but as far as prescribing, mixing, and administering it, you can do it. PAs, very similar, can prescribe, mix, and administer, but they must be under general supervision in most states. So an MD has to be available via phone or telehealth. Now, a registered nurse can administer under standing orders in general supervision. So you need to have an MD available, medical director, MD available by phone or telehealth. They must review your charts periodically. But if you have a standing order in place that has been reviewed by your medical director and approved by your medical director, then you can administer the IV inside of your wellness clinic without them being there. And then as we look at an LVN, LPN, those laws kind of differ. They might have to be IV certified, and they may have to be under direct supervision in most states. So the medical director has to be on site, while an MA or someone who's non-clinical can only prep or support someone who can administer the service. They can't administer the service themselves, not even understanding orders or general supervision. Now, again, this is all very general. I keep wanting to say this. This is all very general. It depends on the state laws. So don't get mad at me if you're like, hey, in my state, we can do this. That may be true. Again, I'm just trying to give you some things to think about, some things to look for when you are doing your research. So another one I just want to walk through here is going to be weight loss, just again, because it kind of differs. So in weight loss, a medical doctor, DO, medical director can prescribe and manage weight loss services. Same thing with a nurse practitioner if the state allows it. And some state is not allowed. They may need a medical director. They may need a collaborating physician in order to do a lot of these things. And then if we look at the registered nurse, the PA, they can prescribe and manage, but they have to be under MD general supervision. So an MD has to be on call pretty much. And then with a registered nurse, they can only administer the injections with standing orders. So they can't prescribe, they can't manage, they have to only administer with a standing order. And then same thing with the LVNs. So again, this differs. So this is where that GFE conversation comes up. If you ever heard of a GFE or a good faith exam, when you're a registered nurse owning and operating a wellness clinic, you're going to need someone to perform a GFE before you can provide that service, right? And you're going to need to have some standing orders on file with protocols in order to provide weight loss services. So that's where this comes from. It's from these types of laws around the corporate practice of medicine and the scope between each license. A lot of the places where you're going to find this information is going to be on your nursing boards. Again, you can always Google. The AI is obviously going to give you an answer, but, always double check that. But, this is generally where these decisions are made and how they're made and why they're made. So want to again show you that that's where that comes from. So jumping back into the slide, what you want to do is, again, go through the motions of making sure that each of your services are aligned with your licensure level and your scope and compliance for your state to ensure that you can properly give those in your wellness clinic or mobilely or via telehealth, so you don't have to worry about that and you can focus on patient care instead of the laws in your state once you launch your clinic, because you know everything has been triple checked and is in place for you to do so. So, some key takeaways here. Your job in this step is to determine what structure and oversight your clinic requires. You do not form any entity or sign any agreements until you're very clear on this. Like I said, get a lawyer involved, especially if you need to, especially if there's any considerations around this that you're unsure about. And then scope of practice rules ultimately determines what can happen inside of your clinic. So with this clarity, now you are ready to choose the services that you want to fit within these rules, right? So once you get a good sense of these rules, you know exactly what services that you can offer. Now, if you enjoyed this course, please feel free to let us know. Book a call with me if any of this is confusing. Trust me, I know it is. It was confusing for me when we first started. There's so many moving parts. There's different licensure levels and laws and gray areas and interpretations and so on and so forth. So if you're in that position, please book a call with me. I would love to talk with you. You want to move faster and avoid any costly mistakes around these things. We can help you do that. We help with your entity setup, compliance, medical director matching, legal and clinical documents, right? So that MSO agreement, we have those templates, as well as we have medical director agreements and templates and all those great things. We help you set up your EMR. We help you with marketing and so much more. So schedule a one-on-one call with me below, and we'll get to talking about where you are now and where you want to go and how we can help you launch. So I'll talk to you on the next video.